Hey, welcome everybody. Welcome to everyone around the world. So I'm going to make it all one video here instead of two parts. Yesterday I had a problem with my time and I had to go do something. So anyways, this is a very important video. This will be life-changing for a lot of people. It will be an absolute shocker to a lot of people. But the evidence that I have here is more than enough to prove what I'm claiming. And as the title says, you can't always fit everything you want to say in a title. But I will show that the Torah has been altered. Okay, I can't definitively prove when and where it was physically altered, but generally speaking, it was altered around the time of Babylon. During Babylon, just after, whenever it might have been, I'm not fussing over exactly when, but the fact was, more importantly, that the Torah was altered. It was altered to include the animal sacrifices, and perhaps a few other dogmatic things, but I'm not worrying about that right now and we're fussing about it. I'm going to focus on the sacrifices here. And for this video, so I'm more well prepared, I've got all the points that I want to make here, so I don't have to always just use my memory. So it should be a little bit more organized. So basically, I want to start off with the following intro because I didn't do this yesterday. And it's important to focus on this philosophical element first. Okay, for starters, there is nobody in their right mind. And let me say this first too, right? I would urge any rabbi to watch this video. Okay, if you're a staunch believer in your Judaism, please watch this video. Hopefully it's half an hour, maybe 45 minutes. But in that time, you'll see more than enough evidence that shows that I'm right. Okay, it will be a shocker for a lot of people. I urge rabbis to watch this, even Rabbi Tovia Singer. I would love to see, there's no comeback. There's absolutely no comeback. The evidence I have here is astounding. But anyways, the philosophical points that I want to make. Number one, nobody in their right mind, I don't care if you're the most staunch, hardcore Orthodox rabbi, anybody in their right mind, okay, if God himself, because if I ask you to be honest to yourself, you wouldn't be honest to yourself. If God himself appeared in front of you and quizzed you and said, despite everything that you think you've heard, been taught, this, that, there, you tell me, man, tell me to my face, do you honestly believe that I wanted and commanded these animal sacrifices with the slitting of the throat, the splashing of blood, and all this and that there? And if God asks you that to your face, and you have one answer that you can give God, okay, are you really, even the most staunch Orthodox rabbi, are you really going to tell God, you have one chance for an answer, that you do believe that he ordered that? Okay, I just want you to reflect on that first, because I think anybody in their right mind would say in brutal honesty to God, I'm told to believe that you commanded it, but personally, God, I don't think you did. And you know why I think that's how most people would answer from within? You know why I think that? Because there's nobody in their right mind who could find any kind of moronic, dogmatic excuse as to, or justification as to why murdering animals in some type of morbid, barbaric, primitive ritual, how that achieves anything. It doesn't achieve anything, and it never will. I don't care what flowery words are written next to it in the Bible, and somebody claimed God said do this. Guess what? You've had thousands of years, and even the greatest rabbis in Judaism, Maimonides and the rest, to this very day, the rabbis, any of them, cannot give a good reason why God would even order such sacrifices. Even the great Maimonides said, essentially, they don't really make sense. They seem barbaric to us, but God obviously, most likely, ordered them because we were addicted to doing sacrifices in Egypt. And because it's human nature, blah, 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 God says, okay, if you're going to do these things, then at least do them to me, for me, instead of these Egyptian gods or whatever. That's what the great Maimonides claims, and many other rabbis. That's actually the least pathetic excuse I've ever heard, right? Out of all of them, because most of the excuses they have don't even make sense. Okay, murdering an animal does not bring you closer to God, and this and that there. That's why I said, unbiased, Maimonides has the best excuse, but it's still pathetic. God doesn't lower his standards to that of humans. Okay, we have to raise our standards to God's. And God should lead by example. If God is telling us to be righteous and do unto others, do even unto the small ones, the little ones, you know what I mean, do good unto them as well, the little creatures even. He's telling us to be righteous and kind to all creation. Do you really think in the same hand he's going to turn around and say, go grab an animal, kill it, a terrible death? You know, these rabbis, they try and say that, oh, the animal doesn't suffer, it's a quick, painless death. No, it's not. Okay, no, it is not. Scientifically, go ask a forensic doctor. When your throat is slit like that, you actually die a traumatizing, torturous death. For starters, the cognition side of things alone, you're literally feeling, seeing, and hearing your blood gurgle out of your carotid artery, whatever it is. It literally bubbles and gurgles out, and your life essence, your blood, is rushing out and pouring out in front of you. You can see it, hear it, smell it, probably even taste it from the sheer volume coming out. And at the same time, you begin to suffocate. And what happens next is you actually suffocate to death while you're in the searing pain as well, and the trauma of all this blood coming out. It doesn't happen instantly, okay? The death, I mean. And as your life escapes you and you're suffocating, you then go into cardiac arrest. So the poor creature's heart would lock up like this, and you would have whole body agony and psychological trauma as he is struggling to breathe and can no longer even breathe. That is evil, evil torture. I don't say, oh, well, people hunt, eat animals. I don't even want to hear it. When God made Adam and Eve and he made Eden, there was no carnivorism. Don't tell me it was God's plan to kill animals. Shut up. Just shut up. People do it now. That's one thing. God didn't make it like that. I don't want to hear it. It's evil. Killing something for food itself isn't evil. If you had to eat food to survive and whatever reason you don't want to eat vegetables or something else, so be it. It's not evil. You're hunting to feed yourself, right? But the Jewish sacrifices were not about food. Only a small portion of them had to do with food. But more importantly, I'm tired of hearing people say this excuse that, oh, well, they're all for food, or most of them were for food, and only some of them weren't. At the end of the day, even if all of them were for food, which they weren't, the fact is, why do you need a primitive, barbaric, pagan, heathen ritual to get your food? Look at all the Gentiles. They want a deer, they'll go get the rifle, they'll go shoot the deer, and then cook the deer. Why do you need to do a ritual? And then they'll say, oh, it's because we're offering it up to God. All this foofy stuff. Okay, at the end of the day, eating food has nothing to do with primitive barbaric ritual. It's got nothing to do with it. You don't need an altar of flame. You don't need all these fancy pants things and fancy clothing and all this and that there and a temple to eat food. Okay? Nor do you need a temple to consecrate your food to God. After all, the Jews haven't had a temple for 2,000 years. And every rabbi on earth says, oh, we don't need a temple to do this and that there. And if we don't have a temple, we don't have to offer the sacrifices. Okay, fine. So if you don't need a temple to do all this food production, then what is the point of all the ritual? The pomp and circumstance. What is the point of it? You see what I mean? Did God really ordain all of that? Do you really think that the almighty creator of the universe stepped down from the heaven of heavens down to this meager, pitiful, little stupid planet with all his infinite wisdom comes down on Mount Sinai, steps out of the cloud, and the first things out of his mouth to Moses are 10 million pages on how to cook little loaves of bread and offer them with oil, and like 10 trillion things to do with ritual. None of these things have any bearing on reality. Offering up cakes to God doesn't do anything or achieve anything. Absolutely at all. Okay, offering food up to God. God doesn't have a nose. He doesn't need to smell anything. You think God delights in the smell of burning animal carcasses? Even if we think it smells good, God created that creature and gave it life. Do you think he really celebrates, hey, I created you, I gave you life, now let's watch you get ripped apart and burned? What joy would God have in that? There's absolutely none. If God had joy in sadism, he would be the devil. If God had joy in sadism, then we wouldn't have had Adam and Eve in Eden the way it was. But clearly God showed us what he wanted. It was not carnivorism. There was no violence. There was no ritual. There was no nothing in Eden. That's what God wanted. So is it really true that God ordained all of these hundreds of seemingly pointless rituals? And people say, even Christians, they'll say, and the rabbis, they'll say like, oh, well, these rituals, even though they themselves are meaningless and achieve nothing, because anybody has to admit that, they would say that, oh, they serve a symbolic purpose that helps teach you something about God. It helps you to draw closer to God and all this and that there. Let me just say this. If you have to make a pancake to get close to God, then you don't know God. If you have to go get a goat and cut his throat to get close to God, then you don't know God. The God you think you know isn't God. Let's put it that way as well. God doesn't need anything. God doesn't want anything. He made everything. Only a fool would think that God needs or wants something. Period. Only a vain, pompous fool would want to sit around for eternity being worshipped by everything in creation. What God would want, logically, is appreciation, gratitude. You know what I mean? All those other more humble, modest, and noble qualities. He doesn't need to be worshipped by trillions of beings incessantly every day for the rest of eternity. What's the point to his existence? To be praised? Don't you see how vain that is? Is God really a God of vanity? He wants to teach us to be humble. Don't you think God leads by example? But the point I'm getting to here is that all these very ritualistic elements that are put in, that are part of Judaism, were put in there. They weren't originally in there. And the reason they were put in there, and I'll have proof for this over the next 45 minutes or whatever, the reason these things are put in there is because all ancient cultures, which were all pagan back then, but all the ancient cultures, sorry, take a sip of my coffee. All the ancient cultures did pagan rituals because they felt that God lived in the sky or on top of a mountain. The ancient primitives would think, oh, when the thunder cracked, it was God speaking. When the lightning struck, he was throwing his thunderbolt, his weapon. This is what and I mean Neolithic primitive. I don't even mean the Romans. The Romans knew better than that. I was reading a document yesterday where the Roman rulers are talking about how clouds crash together and create lightning, and that primitive people think that it's gods in the sky. That's quite alarming and amazing to learn that the ancient Romans knew that. I'm talking about primitive, like cavemen, Neolithic peoples, before they had any understanding of anything. They thought God lived in the sky or on top of a mountain. They thought he rode an actual physical chariot around in the sky. God doesn't need a vehicle. Okay? And God doesn't live on a mountain. God doesn't live in the sky. Okay? But that's what the primitive people thought. Okay? And they thought that God must be like them, even if he was greater, but that he has a mouth and ears, and that's why they think, oh, God has ears, we must sing for him. God has a nose, we must give odors for him, incense and burning animals. He has a mouth. God must be hungry, we should feed him. They might have lots of gods, because they weren't monotheists back then, right? But They're gods, backslash God, whatever, right? Teach their own. And they would think, I gotta feed the gods. So they would set up these little tables and they put the food on it and they would burn incense to attract the deity's attention. Then they would offer the food up. And how do you get food from earth to a god that lives on top or in the sky, on top of a mountain or in the sky? How would you do it? Use fire. Because to the primitive peoples, fire was magic. Okay? They didn't understand how it worked. They didn't know what it was. It was magical. It destroyed things. It created things. It did a lot of stuff. Right? And when they burned the offering, it would go upwards into the sky. So to the primitive people, they would think, if I want to transport this creature or my little pancake up to God, the only way I can do that is by burning it with this magic fire. So they would burn it. Let me tell you, human beings did this for hundreds of thousands of years, if not millions. Okay? If not millions. Most likely hundreds of thousands of years. Now, society today has had cell phones for like 10 years, 20 years, and we have become a cell phone society in our behavior and how we operate. If you do something for hundreds of thousands of years, it will be ingrained into your DNA. The behavior of certain breeds of dogs is bred in. A cattle raising dog is got in its genes to herd cattle, because behavior and action imprint themselves on DNA through enough repetition. So with hundreds of thousands of years, you realize why I'm saying all this. If we as humans for hundreds of thousands of years, no matter what country you lived in, we all did basically the same type of thing. We had lots of gods, we all gave them offerings. We felt in our primitive narrow minds that this is what we had to do to please the God that we never see. Okay? It might have been angels or beings coming down, portraying themselves as gods and complicating, whatever, right? Just simply speaking, right? They felt that we have to do this, right? If we want to see God or get close to God, then we got to give him food. We have to give him wine. We have to do things for him. We have to sing and get his attention. Hey, you know what I mean? That's what they felt. That is honestly what they felt. And everything to do with blood and all these rituals, no matter what you're talking about, Santeria, Satanism, Judaism, no matter what religion you're talking about that deals with blood in its rituals, okay, and it's shameful to say that Judaism's in the same basket as those ones, but just is what it is, because most other religions don't do that. But the whole reason that blood was used in these primitive tribes, tribal religions, is because they realize, hey, if I get cut and my blood goes out, I die. So my life must be in the blood. Even the Bible says the life is in the blood. If you go to the Solomon Islands and down in New Zealand, the Maori tribes, they eat the heart or the brain of their victim because they believe that's where the life force is. So all this primitive understanding, basic scientific concept that life is in the blood keeps you alive, they understood those basic concepts, and because of this, that's why the primitives attached so much importance to blood. Is they figured of all the things in the body, an animal or a sacrificial body, what would be the most closest to God? Oh, he's the giver of life. The blood must belong to God. So this is what all the ancient tribal peoples used to think. Okay, and it's actually parroted or echoed in the Bible as well. Okay, now that was their framework of understanding and why they had to offer God the blood. Okay, you see my point? That's why they burned things on the altars, to send it up to the gods who were floating up above. You know what I mean? So they could smell it up in the sky. It's preposterous. It's very narrow-minded. It's very primitive. But after hundreds of thousands of years, that was ingrained in our DNA. Okay, in every tribe around the world, no matter what color you were, no matter what country you lived in, we all had religions like that. Okay? Now, and there were people on this earth before Adam and Eve, whether you like it or not. Most rabbis acknowledge that anyways. But I'm not getting into petty side arguments. So, flash forward hundreds of thousands of years to the time of Judaism, the time of Moses, and all of that. Then we still have these people over in the lands. All the surrounding peoples around the Jewish people, they were all still pagan. Still doing their primitive beliefs, like I just said. Very, very, still doing it to that very day. Then we had Moses, Okay, his people were stuck in a land of idolatry, immersed in the idolatry. A lot of them were idolatrous at times as well. And Moses was the one little epicenter of change, a little catalyst. And long story short, he helped bring monotheism into the world. Okay, as we're told, I believe, whatever, right? I don't think he was the only person who could conceive of it, but nonetheless, they keep things simple. So through Moses, the monotheism was introduced to the world. Now you think at that great moment on Sinai, like I said, you have the great almighty true God coming down. Why would he spend so much time waffling and waffling and waffling on about primitive sacrifices and offerings when God doesn't have a nose or a mouth to start with? How does making a pancake make you closer to God? It doesn't achieve anything. If you have to bake pancakes or kill goats to get close to God, then you don't know God. You see my point? Why would Almighty God come down and do that? And give so much pointless instruction? It doesn't make sense. That's why I often wonder, again, dwelling on the fact that it's evil to take an innocent creature and make it suffer terribly to serve no purpose. You're going to eat it afterwards? Fine. We'll just kill the animal and eat it. You don't have to do all this primitive ritual. That's why I said all that stuff. Because the only reason all that primitive ritual is in Judaism is because it was falsely inserted in there. I don't believe for 1 second that the true Almighty God gave orders for sacrifices. I have no problem understanding that God would relay some symbolic concepts into some simple forms of ritual so that people could understand certain concepts. I have no problem with that, but he's not going to throw in murdering animals with that to teach you some type of concept and all this and that there. Oh, no. I mean, God himself in the Tanakh says your sin's on your own head. He didn't say your sin's on the head of that goat. He said your sin is on your own head, and nobody will suffer for what you did. He never said that goat will suffer because of what you did. Okay? And the only reason, like I said, that all that stuff is claimed to be in the Torah is because the people at the time who were writing it really thought in their minds, their narrow minds, that God needs offerings, that he wants, needs, and that he would obviously command offerings. So they incorporated it. Because for hundreds of thousands of years, everybody on earth did it. It's been ingrained into our DNA. Okay? It's undeniable. Like how humans yawn, that's ingrained in our DNA. Dogs circle before they go lay down, that's in their DNA. Dogs howl at the moon or at sirens, that's in their DNA. Okay? And it was in our DNA to offer things to gods. Okay? But how could I prove that the Torah was altered? I believe that there was an original Torah. Okay, that was great. It was perfect. It was from God. I believe that. But I also believe that we don't have it anymore. Nobody has it. No special magical Jewish person has it, hidden away in a closet. It doesn't exist anymore. There's no proof of it existing any longer. But I believe that one did exist. Okay, but it's been lost to the ages. And I have proof for all this stuff. Almost everything that I'm going to claim here, I have proof for. And at the end of the video, I have more than enough proof to prove my overall stance. Okay? Now, the theory I'm pitching is that the Torah was altered to include these primitive sacrifices because the people felt that they needed them for God. Okay? And that God actually didn't order them. So when was the Torah altered? Well, the most logical time for it to be altered is during the time of Babylon, because they've been invaded and so forth. So this is where I did my research, and I found out a lot of astonishing things most people don't know. Number one, the average person back then, even in Israel, was illiterate. Probably 90+% of the people were illiterate. They couldn't read or write. Even if you went back in a time machine and gave them a Tanakh straight from God, they wouldn't be able to read it. They wouldn't know what it says. You could have given them a picture book on how to bake, how to play tennis, and tell them, hey, this is the Bible. They'd pretend to read it and say, oh, this is a nice Bible. They'd have no clue what it says because they don't know it. Okay? That's the reality with the people back then. Now next, after that, we have the fact that the original Torah, as all scholars agree, was written in Paleo-Hebrew. They know this because they found old fragments of things and they're in Paleo-Hebrew. And that also was the language back then. So this is one historical fact that helps, one of the points that helps verify my claim in theory. Okay? There was an original Torah that is gone and lost to the ages. Okay? A lot of articles, if you go look up articles on the Bible, on the Tanakh, on this, that, you will find what I'm saying. I'm not making it up. Okay? The original Hebrew is long gone. It's lost. And it was written in Paleo Hebrew. It wasn't even written in Hebrew. It was written in Paleo Hebrew. Technically speaking, a whole different language, a whole different alphabet, a whole different science to the language that we don't know because there's no trace of it left. Okay? It's gone to the ages. The next fact, so remember, most of the people were illiterate. Even if they had it, they couldn't read it. Number two, the original was actually written in Paleo Hebrew, which no longer exists. Okay? Fact number three, the Jews back then in Israel couldn't even speak and write Paleo Hebrew, not just because of the illiteracy part. They weren't aware of Paleo Hebrew. It was a prior language. You see my point? It wasn't even their current language that the ones who could speak could speak. Okay? Now, the book of Ezra or Nehemiah, one of the two, actually talk about this and say that Ezra found a scroll of the Torah in some building somewhere, but the people couldn't understand it. Okay? And one sec. It says that the people couldn't understand it. So what Ezra had to do is he had to retranslate it, rescribe it. Okay? So there's issue number one you have to really focus on. If they found a scroll, why did he have to do any of that? Why did Ezra have to reteach it to the people? They clearly didn't know it at the time. Why did he have to translate it? They clearly didn't know the language it was written in. Why did he have to find it? Because they clearly didn't have it. It's not like he went out, found a telephone book, and said, oh, hey, I found a telephone book we lost. No, it's like, holy moly, what is this? It's in a whole different language. We don't know what it says. I mean, they knew the basic concepts, the people who could read and write. I'm not that dopey, right? But you see my point, right? Those observable facts show you that the basis of what I'm claiming is true, okay? Now, if that's the reality, then it's fair grounds to say that that is the time period in which the Torah could have been altered. Of any time to alter Torah, the best, easiest time would be to do it when people can't speak the language, the Paleo Hebrew. Paleo Hebrew is gone. The people can't even speak or write in their current language. Has been kidnapped, taken away, enslaved, blah, 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 and all this. That's a perfect time to go do it, right? Yes. That's just logic. Nobody could deny that. Okay? Now, so I've established a motive. The motive is hundreds of thousands of years of primitive ritual. That's the motive. That is their inclination to feel the need to include it in the Torah. Okay? That's the motive. We have the time and place, which is ripe. Okay? What's the word for that? Alibi? There's no alibi because it's like the opposite of an alibi. I just don't know what the right word is. But we have the right time and place. Instead of proving that they weren't there, which is an alibi, we're proving that they were there. So they were in the right time and place for this scenario to happen with no language and blah, blah, blah. Okay? So it's very fair for me to put out this theory. It's not far-fetched. I'm not trying to claim some guy snuck in Solomon's temple and sketched over some stuff one night. You know what I mean? So another observable fact from history is that the copy of the Torah that Ezra found is gone. Where is it? It doesn't exist anymore. That's something most people don't point out, but it's logical. It is gone. Not only that, but the one he translated, so the one he created, the new one in the new language that he taught to everybody, even that one is gone. Where is it? It don't exist anymore. I'm not saying they didn't exist. We do not have them. Therefore, we don't know what is in them. Do you see my point? Now, what do we have? What do we have? Well, sorry, this music's driving me nuts. Trying to find something that's neutral. There's not much neutral stuff. Anyways, this sounds a bit better, right? So where was I last? The motive, the time and the place. Next thing, yes. So we don't have the one that Ezra found. We don't have the one that he translated and created. What do we have then? Well, Ezra did all that around 450 BC, give or take. 450 BC. But the Torah that we have, the oldest Torah that Earth possesses, is from 250 to 350 BC. It's not even, that's 100 years off Ezra's. Okay? So again, this is working in my favor. It's not working against my claims, it's working in favor of my claims. So the Torah that we got, the Torah that we got was written 250 or 350 BC. Okay, now the next thing is, if you go look up any article on the history of the Bible, they'll tell you all these things. This isn't a conspiracy, it's all fact. Okay? The one or two fragments that were older, like the elephantine fragments, they're like a couple verses. And in those fragments, they don't even mention a Bible or Tanakh, that there are other books. They don't mention really anything that connects anything too much. Okay? They do show that them and the Dead Sea Scrolls do help support that the Masoretic translation is the correct interpretation of it. That's why I lean towards Masoretic after looking at all the evidence. But the fact is, one very quickly, some people don't know this, the Masoretic, the oldest one, is from like after the time of Jesus. Okay, so even the Masoretic translation, there's no copy older than Jesus. Okay, but we're talking about Hebrew. What's the oldest Hebrew copy? Well, there is no one. There is none, it's gone. So the oldest Hebrew copy is actually the Masoretic. Now, the Masoretic, they claim, is using the correct words. This was validated by finding Dead Sea Scrolls, which are from hundreds of years prior, that actually line up with the Masoretic translation. Okay, so somebody somewhere knew, because remember, the Torah was passed down orally, right? For a very, very long time. Everybody knows this. Okay? The Torah and all that was passed down orally for a very long time. So nobody can say, oh, well, people wouldn't have memorized all that. They did, and they still do to this day. There are rabbis who do memorize that. Okay, you don't have to, there's not that each person has to memorize the whole Bible. You could have one guy memorize one book, one guy memorize, you know what I mean? To each your own. One sec. You know what I'm not doing is looking at my note sheet here. That's fine, I'll get to that in a second. This is all my evidence that I'm going to go through. Yeah, the Bible and the Torah. Blah, 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 blah. I'm waffling too much. The Septuagint is the oldest that we have. It's not the Hebrew anyways. It was a translation from the Hebrew that went missing. Okay, the one we don't have anymore. Any resource will tell you that because it's a fact. Okay, so they translated from the Hebrew. It went missing. They translated it into Greek, which is the Septuagint. That's the oldest one we got. Okay, and that's like 250 BC or whatever it is. Okay, so there's nothing older than that in terms of Torah. Okay. Now, the ironic thing is that the Torah was claimed, according to the Bible and Judaism, they claimed that God gave it to Moses letter for letter on top of Mount Sinai. Okay? Number one problem is some people claim it was written on the tablets. You couldn't fit all of that on the stone tablets. Number two, it doesn't actually say that. It only says God gave Moses the 10 Commandments on the tablets, which were then destroyed. And after that, Moses then wrote them down. But nowhere does it say that the whole of the Torah. I mean, it's ludicrous to think you could fit 5 books on a stone tablet. Okay, so that didn't happen. But what was I getting to again? Anyways, the Septuagint is from like 250, 300 BC or so. The Hebrew from before that is gone. Okay? Now, the Septuagint that they created has a few translation issues and this and that. They altered all the ages of the patriarchs and it throws everything off. Um, and they had to wait hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years for enough Jews to get together and put together a proper Masoretic version, okay, which came way after Jesus. Okay, so that's like the layout in the history and the timing of the Bible for the Torah. Okay, now the rest of the Bible, we have lots of other books in the Tanakh, right? Um, you got 5 books in the Torah, and you got out of whatever is it, what is it, 24 books or something? I don't know. Just say 24 books in total. I think offhand there's about 55 or 60% of the books of the Tanakh don't even talk about sacrifice. There might be a couple mentions, a few anomalies or whatever, but generally, virtually speaking, not even generally, but virtually speaking, about 55 or 60% of the books in the Tanakh don't even mention sacrifice, virtually speaking. Okay? A good number of them do not mention it or literally just rebuke it. Okay? Now, these books happen to be the prophets. And if you look at a chronology of when the biblical books were actually written, and I mean actually written, okay? Now I remember what I was going to say. When you actually look at when they were written, you see a very big difference with what is claimed. Okay, so I'll link back with what I forgot. Now, they claim that the Torah is given by Moses. It's given to Moses, and Moses lived around 1400 BC. The reality is, Moses did not get, well, he got a Torah back then. Okay, I believe that there was an original, but it's gone. My point is, we are told that the one that we have is one that he was given in 1400 BC, but that is not true. The one that we cannot prove it. The one that we have is from 1200 years later. It is not from the event at Sinai. You had 1200 years for anybody in the universe to come and write whatever they want and claim, hey, this was given to Moses on Sinai. Until you find one from the time of Sinai, you can't prove diddly squat. It's all fairy tales, well-wishing, and imagination. Okay? The stark reality is, we don't have any copy of anything of the Torah until then, 250, whatever, 300 BC. I would like to believe that there was something, but it's gone. Look, that's just the reality of it. Okay? But it makes you wonder, why did they wait so long to write the Torah when we're all led to believe the Torah is the first books of the Bible, and chronologically, in order of, the creation timeline and whatever, the human timeline, they are, and it should be the first books of the Bible. And why were they written so late? If the whole religion started with Moses, as we learn from the Torah books, why weren't they written first? They were. Where'd they go? But that leads you back to, well, then why were they written again in 200-something BC? When you start to look at the facts, then you realize that what I'm proposing has fair grounds. Okay? For it to be altered, you got that 1200-year period in which anybody could have altered it, and nobody could say anything. No one would even know. As evidenced by the story with Ezra, where they found a scroll, nobody knew it, and they had to be taught it in 450 BC. Okay? So the tangible evidence that's observable backs up my theory in every step of the way. Okay? So they had to have a reason for waiting 1200 years let me word that better. There must have been a good reason that we don't have an older copy than 200-something BC. Okay? But the very fact that we don't have one, we have to really, really investigate, is what we got in 200 BC accurate? It is 1200 years later. Can you imagine 1200 years from now, somebody writing a book about the Donald Trump, Joe Biden presidency battle? They weren't here for 1200 years. How the hell would they know what happened? Going by some history books and word of mouth and wives' tales passed down for 1200 years? That's not good enough. You know what I mean? So that's a real comparison. We're talking 1200 years. How is somebody going to know about Donald Trump and Joe Biden in great detail, enough to quote them verbatim and write a book. Give me a break. It's ridiculous. So nobody, no rabbi, the biggest, fanciest rabbi, you cannot claim to know what was in the Torah before 300 BC. You cannot claim it. It's imaginary. Okay? And until I pray we find an old copy, I hope we do. I kind of believe we will by the miracle of God, but until we do, nobody can claim what was in there. Likewise, I cannot claim what was or what was not in there. But what I am doing in this video is looking at observable evidence. And what we can see, like I said, is 55-60% of the books of the Tanakh virtually don't even speak of or outright rebuke sacrifices altogether. That's over half. The only books of the Tanakh which actually do talk about sacrifice and edify them are primarily the Torah, then also Deuteronomy, of course. I'm just trying to think of the... I won't think of the numbers. It's overcomplicating to do mental math. You got 5 books of the Torah. Then you got Joshua, Samuel, Kings. What do they call them? The 4 histories or something like that. There's another one I'm forgetting. And then Deuteronomy. Okay? They pretty much all talk about the sacrifices. And when you look at the chronological listing of the biblical books, not when they were written, but when they should be read, in what order, like when you open up any Bible, it's basically the first half, a little bit less, so it's like 45% or whatever, but like the first half of the books are the ones that talk about sacrifice. The next half are the ones that basically don't. Why would we see this? If God really did ordain sacrifice, we would see it throughout. Yeah, there might be portions or things here or there where it's just not talked about, fine. But you wouldn't see something so starkly different. One half where it's all about it, one half where it ain't about it, it's actually strongly against it. I've got a list here of 19, 20, 21, 22, 23. I've got over 23 verses. I had 18 before, but I've actually got 23 verses. And there's more, but I stopped at 23 today. 23 verses from the Tanakh, from those books I just mentioned, right? The latter half. And they outright rebuke sacrifices. They outright rebuke it from every conceivable angle on the compass. There's no way that God ordained sacrifices. There's no way. So again, I'll read those verses in a moment when I get to them. That'll be the proof of my claim there. But anybody with basic knowledge of the Bible might be aware of that already. But looking at the observable things here, right? You got the first half, which is all for sacrifice, followed by the second half, which is basically not mentioning it or outright against it. Why would we have this? Especially considering that the first half was written 1,200 years later. And the first half was actually written, not all of it, but it gets super complicated because there's 5 books in the Torah. Deuteronomy was actually written earlier. It was changed many times and redacted over the centuries, another fact, but Deuteronomy was written earlier. Joshua, Samuel, Kings, and all that, those ones there that talk about the sacrifices were written around the time of King Hosea, okay, just before the Babylonian invasion. King Hosea was also 8 years old when he became king, which makes no sense to me because I know a 7-year-old child, and there's no way that a 7-year-old child could run a nation. But anyways, that's just always baffled me. But of all the able-bodied people in the land, there had to be an 8-year-old child. But anyways, I'm not trying to be mean here. But all those books, the earlier written books, which do mention sacrifices, all of them were written around the reign of King Hosea, just before the Babylonian invasion, which is around 580 BC or whatever it was. Okay? Now, the reality, observable factual reality, is that the oldest book of the Bible, period, okay, I already talked about how the Torah, you can't predate it beyond 250 or 300 BC, right? I already covered that. What about all the rest of the books? Of all the other books in the Tanakh, the oldest one is about 750 BC. That was, I think it was Amos. Where is it? Amos or something. Now, I did have him written somewhere. Here we go. So this is the following. From 750 to 540 BC, to around 200 years, we have the following. We have mostly the prophets. We actually have 12 of the books of the prophets. I think there's only 15 or 16 or something prophets, but 12 of the prophets, and Malachi and Daniel just lived a lot later. So basically speaking, like all the prophets were written between 750 to 540 BC. Okay? And we're actually, more specifically, because I generalized the time bracket there, I made it wider. But most of those prophet books are actually written from 750 to like 600. So even further back than further away from the time of Babylon's invasion, the invasion of you know what I mean, the Babylonian invasion. So you get from 750 to 540, we have most of the prophets. We got 12 books being written. We have 5 books of the writings. Okay, we have the book of Psalms, and these altogether, like I just said, the 12 books of prophets, the book of Psalms, all of these don't mention sacrifices, or only in like 1 or 2 spots, but virtually don't speak of them and outright rebuke them. These are the books written first. So if you're talking about Judaism, you're looking at verifiable facts, all the first books, the first written books, that's when Judaism tangibly began as a religion, arguably, they don't mention sacrifices or rebuke them. From 750 to like 600, I expanded the bracket here to 540 BC. Instead of having like 6 tiers, I just broke it into 2. 750 to 540, then from 540 to 250. That's the reason why, in case you're wondering. So in the next time bracket, from 540 up to 250 BC, okay, we have the Torah being written, and that's towards 250. Okay, you have the book of Daniel, just because he came about last. Malachi was one of the later prophets as well. So there are 3 later prophets. And also, we have Chronicles and Ezra and Nehemiah. Ezra and Nehemiah were originally one book. Now, consider this. All those books that were written first, virtually speaking, don't edify the sacrifices or don't talk about them or outright rebuke them. Then a long time later, then you get the Torah, which does talk about the sacrifices. You get Chronicles, which does talk about the sacrifices. And you get Ezra and Nehemiah, which ironically, out of all the books of the prophets, Ezra and Nehemiah and Ezekiel are the only 3 that really talk about sacrifices. Okay? Now, Ezekiel is the anomaly, and Ezekiel, Judaism didn't even accept it as an authentic book for a very long time. I like portions of Ezekiel, but unfortunately, I think Ezekiel has either just been altered or it's a fabrication. I can't trust it based on the things that are written in there. Almost every single one of here we are about the sacrifices. Almost every single one of the sacrifices Ezekiel prescribes contradict the ones given in the Torah. And that is the reason Judaism turned this book away for a very long time. But anyways, Ezekiel is an anomaly for that very reason. It was written during the time of Babylon. But the other 2, like I said, Ezra and Nehemiah, of all the other books of the prophets, they're the only ones beside Ezekiel that talk about the sacrifices. But they only mention them in like 1 verse, in like passing. So arguably, I always count Ezra, Nehemiah, and Ezekiel as the odd ones out that edify sacrifice. But technically speaking, Ezra and Nehemiah only have like 1 mention of them. They're not really even established, you know what I mean? So as like a command from God and whatever, you could argue. So really what we have is the meat of the basis for sacrifices coming from the Torah and the Chronicles in this time period. And in the prior time period, just from the way I broke it up, we had Deuteronomy and Deuteronomy obviously talks about the sacrifices, but that was written just before the Babylonian exile started. My whole claim here to theory is that the Torah that we had originally is gone. That's a fact. You can't even argue that. And that the one that we have has been altered. Okay? When was it altered? Sometime around Babylon. That's what my theory is. I don't know exactly when. It might have been done in stages. Okay? But I'm just basing my theory and what I'm believing on observable facts. Okay? If Deuteronomy had been written in 750 BC and it talked all about the sacrifices, I would not be here making this theory. Okay? We had all those other books that came first, which don't, and which outright rebuke the sacrifices. So anyways, to wrap this part up, okay, to wrap this point up, we see the pattern. No sacrifice, then sacrifice. That's dumbing it down. Okay? No sacrifice, then sacrifice. If sacrifice really was instituted at the start, like is claimed, then we would see all the first written books talk about it. But we don't. That leads me to believe that sacrifice was not part of the original Torah. If it was, then we would have seen all of that talked about in the first written books. You see my point? But what we do see observably is no sacrifice and then sacrifice. And all the sacrifice seems to appear in the text, what do you know, around the time of Babylon, or just after, or just before. Okay? But around the time of Babylon. Observable facts. Now, of those other books, Joshua only has 5 verses which mention sacrifice. 4 of them are from one paragraph. So technically you could say there's only 2 verses that talk about sacrifice. And it's just, there's not enough basis to it to say that, oh, Joshua edifies and commands sacrifices as a book. You know what I mean? Kings and the other ones, they do. And ironically, Samuel, 1 Samuel is full of sacrifices. But in 1 Samuel, which was written in that first time period from 750 to like 600 BC, right? Remember that? Actually, no. Samuel was with Joshua, Deuteronomy, and then written in the time of Hosea. Sorry, I apologize. Works more in my favor, actually. But 1 Samuel, even though it's full of sacrifices, he actually turns around in there and lets something very fishy slip out. He says, let me go bring it up, actually. It'd be better if I read it than go from memory. I think it was 1 Samuel 15. Yeah. 15:22. And Samuel saith, Has God had delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices, as in the hearkening to the voice of God? Lo, hearkening than sacrifice is better, to give attention than fat of rams. That might just be a little confusing noodle scratch if you're reading the rest of 1 Samuel that's full of sacrifice. But I want to raise an important point here. This isn't a flaw in my theory. I mean, this isn't something that shows that my theory is flawed. This actually does work in favor of my theory, because if the original Torah didn't command sacrifice, and if somebody got in around the time of Babylon, or some people, and altered things, we would see, in that latter case, stuff like this happen. You got the whole of the book telling you sacrifice, 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 and then suddenly, bam, right in the middle of nowhere, you got Samuel himself, not some guy on the road, but Samuel saying, oh, God would rather, good things instead of sacrifice. What right does Samuel have to do that? If the law of God is to sacrifice, who the hell is Samuel to come out and say, oh, you don't need to sacrifice. God wants this more. You see my point? It actually works in my favor. It shows that I'm correct. Okay? My little quick notes here. It says, even in 1 Samuel, it says God prefers goodness over sacrifices, etc. This shows a precedent that is already existing in Samuel's time there, and a stance, thus, against such. And and it shows a conflict with the supposed law that God gave. If God really gave the law in the Torah, which includes sacrifice, and that's his law, and you ain't allowed to change one dot of it, and you're supposed to hang on a tree whoever says to change it, who the hell is Samuel to come around and say that, oh, you don't need to do sacrifice, you can do something else that's better? You know who Samuel was in saying that? He was on the right page. That's who the hell he was. And that little verse right there is a crack in the eggshell. Okay? It's a crack in the eggshell. It shows you that the theory that's flawed isn't mine. It's the theory of Judaism that God commanded sacrifices. That's a crack in your egg right there. Okay? Why would Samuel say that? For those three good reasons. Okay? Shows a precedent which already exists before it was written there. It shows that God and him, Samuel, have a stance against the sacrifices as illustrated. And it shows by him saying this that he is causing a conflict with the supposed law of God that God gave. If Samuel is a man of God, he's not going to cause a conflict. Which means if Samuel said this, then clearly this must be true from the law of God. Now, when you read the law given to Moses, as we see in the Torah, do we see God make a stipulation? Oh, I'm going to give you 10 trillion pages of seemingly meaningless sacrifice. Did he fit in anywhere? Oh, by the way, you don't actually need to do them. You could just pay attention to me. No, God didn't say that. Well, the Torah doesn't say God said that, does it? No. It gives you page after page after page of mindless sacrifices, commanding you to do it or you'll be cut off. Right? So, thank you. This shows a precedent. That alone shows you, when you see two contradicting things like that, all of these mentions of sacrifices in Samuel, and then bam, you get a verse like this. That shows you, my friends, that the Torah was altered. Okay? That right there, one little tiny little fact, but it helps you to see that the Torah was altered. Okay? Because if it wasn't altered, we wouldn't have that verse in Samuel. We wouldn't. And if it was so true that God always had in his law you could do sacrifice or not do sacrifice, he would tell you that when he gave it to you, but he didn't. What he gave was very clear. Supposedly, you got to do sacrifices or else you're going to get in trouble. You'll be cut off and all this nasty stuff. And then bam, out of the woodwork, here comes one. Oh, well, you don't have to do it, actually. You can just pay attention to me. It's a lot cheaper to do that. You don't have to pay for a bull. You don't have to kill something. You don't have to get bloody. Just, hey, pay attention. Right? That little conflict right there shows you that it's been altered. And that what we are given, what we've been presented with as Torah, has been altered. Okay? And what has been altered to contain? Obviously sacrifice. Or did some desperate guy come in and try to alter Torah to rebuke sacrifice? I guess that would be the naysayer argument against my argument here, right? But what person in Judaism is going to say that? Come on, nobody. You're never going to hear that theory being pushed. And what actually makes more sense? Let's address it here. What makes more sense? The theory that someone snuck in and put in sacrifices, or someone snuck in and took out sacrifices? What would make more sense to an all-loving God? A religion with murdering animals for no purpose, or a religion where you pay attention to God? What makes more sense? Thank you. So I know I'm right. Now, another interesting thing is that the word Levite doesn't even occur in the book of Psalms. Psalms was written before all those Torah books were written. The Torah books have a huge emphasis on the Levites and all this and that there. I want to mention something about the Levites. You know how the Levites were picked? Just mentioning something here, right? The Levites were picked because after Aaron, I never understood why Aaron could be the idolater to build the idol and tell people to worship it, but then he gets patted on the back and gets given a great office and noble title after, but the people get killed off. I don't understand that one. Even if he did it tongue-in-cheek, like, oh, you're so dumb, here's your God, worship him, he should still get in trouble for that. But anyways, I mean, if I went through the streets of Israel tongue-in-cheek with an idol saying, hey guys, worship this guy led you out of Exodus, I think I'd probably be put to death. You know what I mean? So why does Aaron get patted on the back for doing it? Never understood that. But after Aaron made the golden calf and got everybody to worship it, God got so angry, according to the Torah, that he told Moses, instruct everybody to pull out the sword and kill all their family members. Now, I don't care what God floats down out of the clouds. If a God comes down and tells me to murder my family, I'm going to tell him to F off. And if he wants to smite me, and he could blink and will smite me. But ain't no God of mine going to tell me to do that dumb nonsense. Okay? It really angers me that people are so dumb that they believe God does stuff like this. God supposedly told him, hey, Moses, tell them all to kill each other. Kill their own mother, father, son, grandfather, everything. Kill them. Kill each other. So Moses made the command, but the only people who did all the murdering were this group of people. And God said, okay, thank you for doing that. According to the Torah, God said, okay, all of you who killed everybody, I'm going to make you my Levites. So do the Levites even have some type of noble foundation? Not really. They were just the ones who murdered all their friends and family over a statue. Like, if the God of the universe, no disrespect, God, I'm only saying this because I think you would agree. If the God of the universe gets that uptight about people bowing to a statue, they didn't worship the statue because they thought the statue was God. They didn't worship the statue because they thought God was a cow. They worshiped the statue as a symbol of God. And if you think doing that is worthy of being killed by your own family members as an order from God, then we live in the friggin' Twilight Zone. Okay? That's all I could tell you. That is all I could tell you. Alright? But we're led to believe from the Torah that God said this. I'll tell you now, using common sense, there's no way in God's green earth that God's going to come down and tell people to kill their own family. Didn't God just tell you at Sinai, don't even speak back to your mother and father? Doesn't the law of Moses say, if you raise a hand to your father, you'll be put to death? Then why in the name of God would God, who hates hypocrisy, turn around and command you to kill your family? It's sick. It's absolutely sick. But the Torah, you see, it puts all this emphasis on Aaron, on the Levites and their priesthood. When you stop and think about it, the priests, they got everything. They got money, didn't really have to do anything. They got all the best food, didn't really have to do anything. They just sat around the temple all day, basically doing nothing, and waiting for people to bring in animals for them to torture, kill, and eat some of it. They didn't have to work. Kind of a cushy setup, don't you think? Now, I'm not here to... Part of my theory is not that this was a priestly conspiracy to get, to milk the people and get rich off of it. It's possible. I don't care enough to research to see if that's what happened. Okay? But those are observable things that we can notice. The Levites don't have to work. They get everything, even though they don't have to work. Kind of makes you scratch your head. Well, what's the reasoning for it, you might wonder? What about their founding? Did they do some great noble deed? Did they save the nation from a battle? Did they do this? Nope. They were actually just the ones that killed all their family members. Kind of not a nice reason to be special, is it? People who do that nowadays, that kill their whole family members, they make the news, then they go in straitjackets and in mental institutions, and the whole world looks at them like they're nutcases. Why should it be different with the Levites? Because the Torah told us God came down from heaven and commanded it? Come on. God came down to all the Muslims and told them to do stuff too. Like in their Quran, where it says you should crucify Jews and Christians in Surah 530. All the non-believers. Muhammad would just say, oh, well, God came down and told me this, so hey, that's what it is. Right? Problem with that. So, another very interesting thing. So, I just wanted to mention, Levite doesn't occur in Psalms. Psalms was written before the Torah and the other books, but it doesn't mention Levite. Very interesting, don't you think? In fact, when I searched for Aaron, it was only mentioned twice. I was actually surprised. I really honestly thought I would find all about Levites and Aaron, and I just assumed it would be there. Is this an observable fact that they're not there, which is kind of interesting. I don't know necessarily if that's that important, but I thought I would mention it though. Even when you search for the word priest, it only occurs 5 times in all of the Psalms. One of them is about Melchizedek, one is about Moses and Aaron. The other three are irrelevant, basically. It just says priest in a general sense. What I'm getting to here is, just in the book of Psalms, I mean, this argument goes out the door when you compare the other books, but just looking at the book of Psalms, for argument's sake, if we were to divulge information on God's priesthood from the book of Psalms alone, you wouldn't really be able to divulge much. You'd have one verse that talks about God has the Melchizedek priesthood, and it's talking about Messiah, you're going to be king and priest of Melchizedek priesthood, yada yada. Then we got one other verse about Moses and Aaron being priests. There's no establishment of the Levitical priesthood and of sacrifices and blah 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 and all that priestly stuff. You got those two mentions, so it's kind of like, take your pick, Melchizedek priesthood or Moses and Aaron priesthood. In fact, if you're just looking at, this is being argumentative, but if you just looked at the book of Psalms, you would have no reason to think that there's a Levitical priesthood. You might actually, you actually would have more reason to think it is a Melchizedek priesthood, and perhaps Moses and Aaron are under that. I just wanted to mention that. I mean, this is this argumentative point, but I think it is interesting to make that. But anyways, so what point should I mention next? I'll mention this real quick. The Code of Hammurabi. The Code of Hammurabi was actually written on stone tablets. They still exist, unlike Moses' ones. And the Code of Hammurabi is shockingly identical to the Law of Moses. The only people saying that it's not are the rabbis. If they had actually read the Code of Hammurabi, like I did, large portions of it the other day, it is shockingly close to Moses's. Some things seem like they're plagiarized, almost word for word. But the more important thing is that the framework, the essence of each law, has basically been copied over. Now, that's not a major deal. You know, it's not a big problem, but I'm just making a mention here because my whole theory is that these people from hundreds of thousands of years had these primitive concepts ingrained into their minds, into their DNA, feeling the need to give God these sacrifices. They have a primitive understanding of God. Okay? Now, if you have a primitive understanding of God, and if all the nations who are likewise primitive around you have primitive understandings of God, okay? Now, if all the other nations around there at the time had similar law systems, it's no surprise that they would have a similar one as well. So it's not a shocker. It doesn't really change anything, but it does show that they didn't come up with something unique. That's the important thing. So think, is God going to come down out of heaven and give you something just like the Babylonians had? God didn't come down to any nation besides Israel, according to the Jews. But according to this evidence, it kind of looks like he came down to Babylon. I'm not saying he did. It's tongue-in-cheek, sarcasm, but it kind of looks like he came down to Babylon first, doesn't it? Gave them a law. Maybe they got it wrong, then he came along after the Moses. I'm just being sarcastic. My point is, we can clearly see that the Torah that we have emulates Babylonian text. Not only that, but the story of Genesis, everybody knows, is basically lifted off the pages of the Enuma Elish and the other Sumerian and Babylonian scriptures that I've read. Okay? But those are minor points. But it does help support the fact that while in Babylon and immersed in the heathen, in the heathen Babylonian practices and all that, okay, and with the hundreds of thousands of years of primitive own practices as humans, combining all that together, it doesn't surprise me at all. It only helps support my theory that they would copy the elements from surrounding nations. Because as we're about to see, they copied the sacrifices from all the surrounding nations. That's my favorite part of this video. That sealed it for me when I found that out. I'm going to get to that next. Many of the laws in the Code of Hammurabi, I'm sorry, I'm not going to waste 10 minutes reading it. I have it open here. But trust me, it's shockingly similar. Actually, no, there is something important that I wanted to read here. Where was it? Here we go. Oh, yeah, this is important. Code of Hammurabi was written 750 BC. The Torah was written 250 BC. That's a 1,500-year difference. 1,500! 1,500 years is the difference from Moses to Jesus. That's a big time difference. You're telling me God came down on Sinai and gave Moses a law that just happens to be like the one they gave to Babylon? Give me a break. There's so many things that are similar. It's astonishing. I mean, it really is. I mean, I've got like 50 pages of the Code of Hammurabi here. I'm not going to, I did it all over the last few days. I just can't be bothered to go look through this again for certain, but trust me, there's certain ones, if you were to compare, here are some comparisons here. I can't be bothered to go through all these again. But trust me, when you compare them, you're going to say, yeah, okay. It's like how you have a slave, just for example, 6 years, release them on the 7th. You do your fields for 6 years on the 7th. I mean, there's so many elements, man. Like, I would just say offhand, like, a majority of the law of Moses, as we are told is in the Torah, is basically what's in the Code of Hammurabi. And I've always heard the rabbis say that, we know that we, Judaism, are right because God didn't come to any of the other nations. I mean, you tell me, why wouldn't he? That's one point I've always wanted to make. Why? You know what I mean? What makes Israel so special? Because Abraham did something nice? Give me a break. So they claim God never came to any of the other nations. He only bothered to come to Israel, and he only gave a law to Israel. This is what Judaism teaches. Like orthodoxy, like none of the other nations have a law. They're under Noahide law, but they don't have a law system from God. And they make a big deal about this, right? Well, your law system that you're claiming was given by God and is in the Torah observably, that's basically a copy of what Babylon had 1,500 years before you. It's shockingly, disgustingly similar. Only a buffoon would say it's a coincidence. Only a true buffoon would say that. Okay? In fact, the more I read the Code of Hammurabi, the more my opinion of Babylonian people changed. Because why were Babylonians so evil? We're led to believe they're a big, dark, nasty bunch of people who did terrible things. Reading through this code of law, I'm sorry, but like this code of law is as good or more noble than Moses' one. It is 1,500 years prior. Babylon, in fact, most scholars say that this is a very good code of ethics, especially for ancient times. It talks about eye for an eye law. If you break someone's leg, your leg will be broken. Yeah, all the same things as Moses' law. Is actually a pretty good ethics law for a primitive society from like 2,000, 3,000 years ago, right? It's pretty darn impressive. And it's not full of evil stuff. It's not full of evil stuff. I'm sitting there reading through this like, what did they do that's so evil? They just had a different God? If God was so angry at the other nations worshiping other gods, and why didn't he get off his butt, go down there and appear to them? He just appeared to Israel and then give Israel the good stuff and then hate on everybody else? Kind of stupid, don't you think? So God doesn't do that. Of course God's not going to do that. It's preposterous. Absolutely preposterous. God doesn't favor people. God even told Israel, I didn't pick you out for your righteousness. I didn't pick you out because you're the biggest or the best nation. So what did you pick them out for then? Right? What? Random lottery ticket? Oh, it's me, Israel today. Let's go down to them and ignore everybody else for thousands of years. And then hate on them and demonize them. The reality is, Babylon, very successful nation, had a very good code of ethics. Still not good by our standards today, but a very good code of ethics. As good, or possibly even arguably better, than the one Moses gave. Okay? The law of Moses. You see, all the pompous Jewish or Christian people, a lot of Christian ministers defend the law of Moses and say that Babylon's law system was dark and had bad things in it and was harsher. These fools haven't even read the Code of Hammurabi. Moses' law is way harsher than the Code of Hammurabi. Almost every little thing in the law of Moses will get you killed. The most stupid, insignificant thing will get you killed. Pick up sticks on the Sabbath, holy moly, kill that guy. There is nothing like that in the Code of Hammurabi. Killing people over the dumbest little things is not in the Code of Hammurabi. They might have harsh methods of punishment, but so did ancient Israel. In ancient Israel, if you got prosecuted for, I think it was lying or something like that, they heated up a long rope of lead and put it down into your gullet and down into your stomach so that it would slow cook your intestines. And when ancient Israel would stone somebody, they didn't throw rocks at you. The prescribed method was to take the person up to a 30-foot height. It was measured out so that when you dropped the person off the edge, almost all the bones in their body and their back would break, but it would be just a short enough height to keep them alive. So they would have all their bones broken, broken rib cage, suffering, punctured lungs, suffering to death. And while they're suffering, the people come around and they have to pick up a rock that requires, I think it was 3 or 5 people to lift. If it takes less, then it's not heavy enough. You then pick up that rock and throw it down on the person's crushed rib cage. And then leave them. So don't tell me Babylon had harsher punishments than Israel. Okay? Israel, you hit your father, put him to death. How would that be if we lived in a world like that today? Everybody would be dead. I'm not saying everybody hits their parents. But you know what I mean? It's ridiculous. The Code of Hammurabi is about just as good. So the only real difference is the name of the god that they worship. Or is it because in the Bible, the Jews called God Baal? In the famous verse, don't call me Baal anymore. I'm tired of being called Baal. I'm taking the name of the Baalim out of your mouth. Call me Ishi from now on. So even in the Bible, according to the Torah, they called God Baal. So arguably, is there really that much difference between the Code of Hammurabi and that? The next thing is, Israel even named a month Tammuz, which is one of the Babylonian gods. But yet the Torah law says, don't let the name of other gods be mentioned on your lips. I guess they forgot when they wrote Tammuz. You see, some scholars have suggested that they were so immersed in Babylonianism while in Babylon that they felt God had these elements. And that's why they included it when they wrote it. I'm not alone in thinking that all this stuff was put in Babylon. I am not the only person who thinks that it was written during or after Babylon and that it was influenced by Babylonianism. I am not the only person saying that. Okay? Most scholars agree with that. And that's, like they say, why you have Tammuz. I mean, you write a law or receive a law, whatever you want to believe, that says don't say the name of other gods. Well, it's the law, right? You break the law, you get put to death. Don't break the blinking law. The law actually says if you say the name of other gods, it'll put you to death. Okay, well, let's go make a month named Tammuz. Are they trying to get the whole nation killed? Stupid. And then Shiva. Shiva's god of Hinduism. They use that word in Hebrew as well. Sit and meditate in Shiva. Yeah, I guess they forgot that too, right? A little bit ridiculous when you stop and think about it. The next thing I want to mention is how the Ark of the Covenant, the tabernacle, for such, and the cherubim on top, are all Egyptian and Babylonian. The cherubim are elements from Egyptian, Babylonian, and many other nations at the time. Is probably the chief symbol of Egypt and Babylon. But focusing on Egypt here, the Ark and the tabernacle were copied from Egyptian arks and tabernacles. In Egypt, the gods would dwell in a tent or tabernacle, and they would also dwell in an ark, which was transported around on 2 staves. Everything in Egypt was either made of gold or coated in gold. So even the Egyptian ark was likely made of wood with gold, and it was carried around on 2 staves. You can see it in their hieroglyphs and their art and everything. So we have these shocking similarities. Now, the apologists for Judaism say, oh, it's because they were immersed in Egypt, and, they admit that much. They were immersed in Egypt, and they just copied these elements. Fine. You admit that much. That's good. Right? Because at the end of the day, just admit that with Babylon too. And the Torah. But they're too afraid to do that. Okay, so the Ark, the Tabernacle, the Cherubim. Why would God give you a law? Why is there so many contradictions? Right? Why would God give you a law saying, don't make an image of any creature that is in the heavens or the earth? And then make a law in the same mouth saying, hey, make an image of these heavenly creatures and put them in the temple. Not only that, but he had like 6 million images of cherubim all throughout the temple in these other rooms. I'll never understand that. Never understand that. Let me watch my time. Oh, I gotta get going soon. That sucks because I don't even have time to read some of this other stuff here. So what else is important? I covered that. I did cover most of this. The only thing left I got to do is read the verses. So the last thing to mention is this. I found out there is something called the Amarna letters. These were found a while ago, in the Middle East cave or something like that, like the Dead Sea Scrolls. Long story short, because I'm running out of time, the Amarna letters, very, very ancient. I can't remember offhand if they were in Paleo-Hebrew, but this is when I was researching all these things. So anyway, scholars found these ancient texts with the Amarna letters. There's a whole pile of them. And when I was flicking through the list, just out of interest, right, I noticed that there's one labeled from the King of Jerusalem. And I'm like, huh, hold on. Because the Amarna letters are from 1400 BC. That's before Moses did the Exodus. That's before Jerusalem. What does that show you? It shows you the Torah has been altered. Okay? In the Amarna text, there's a king of Jerusalem. I could pull up the... I do have it here. This is one thing I had ready. The Amarna letters. Okay, in the Amarna letters, we go down to this one here. It's all different kings from all different nations. Gubal, king of this guy, talking to Pharaoh. This guy talking to Pharaoh. Pharaoh talking to another guy. It's all these different nations around there. Damascus talking to some other king. But some of them are Israel. Are Jerusalem, king of Jerusalem. Here we go. King Abdi-Heba. Jerusalem king, Abdi-Heba talking to Pharaoh. EA number 285. I read all the ones from the Jerusalem king. I'm sitting there thinking, hold on a second. I have never heard in my life that Jerusalem existed back in 1400 BC. I thought they had to go do an exodus with Moses, get over to the promised land, wander around for 40 years, then get in there, then defeat the nations, and then many centuries later, then build a temple, and then all of that would happen. But all of a sudden, Jerusalem existed in 1400 BC? And it legitimately did. Like, we got all the tablets here from that time. King of Jerusalem. How the hell was there a Jerusalem back in 1400 BC before Moses did the Exodus? The thing that crossed my mind is King Melchizedek was Salem. But it weren't called Jerusalem. It's called Salem. I believe Jerusalem is the new Salem. That's what I personally believe. But my point is, there's no biblical mention in the Torah of this stuff. Okay? There were kings in Jerusalem at the time. And when you go read these texts, and you read what the pharaohs are saying back and forth to each other and all that stuff, you come to find out there are people called Hebrews. Now, scholars, not me, scholars have suggested Hebrews most likely is a rendition of Hebrews. Now, Hebrews were spoken about by all these surrounding nations, because the Hebrews, whoever they were, arguably, were present in a lot of nations. They were nomadic, kind of like how the Israelites were. They lived in tents. They would invade other lands, wipe out people, commit genocides. They were very violent. They would steal, plunder from... And they sounded like bad, nasty criminals. But then when you stop and without bias, you think, well, hold on, what did the Torah actually tell us they did after the Exodus? They went around and killed every living, breathing creature in 5 lands. Plundered the people, took many slaves. And it says that the Hebrews are wandering nomads who do just that. And they have lots of slaves with them. That's the description about the Hebrews. Not only that, but the Hebrews lived in the land which was referred to as Israel in one of the Egyptian texts that's been recently talked about, in recent years in the news. And not only that, it's the only mention of Israel in ancient texts, Israel. And now I find out Jerusalem existed, and that's where the Hebrews lived. Kind of makes you stop and think, doesn't it? Kind of makes you stop and think. But anyways, these are the following verses because I only have 10 minutes. I may have time to read them all out, but let me just read through the verse names before I get into. Oh shoot, I'm forgetting something very important. Forget that. That's for later. Um, the animal sacrifices. How could I forget this? Good Lord. The animal sacrifices. This is what I wanted the main body of my thing to be about, and of course I forgot it till the end here. I really should have shut up and talked about this first. But the animal sacrifices in Judaism, to save time, they were copied from the surrounding pagan nations. Literally copied. Not even like they're similar, they were copied. Okay? I was dumbfounded when I learned this over the last few days. I really was dumbfounded and I felt stupid. I felt stupid for not, in all the things I pride myself in studying and learning of all different cultures and religions, I didn't know this very basic thing. This caused me so much woe and grief in my faith over the years. Trying to understand why God would ordain barbaric animal sacrifice. Couldn't believe I didn't know this. But here's the long and short of it, because I have less than 10 minutes. Ironically, all the beast kingdoms that are spoken of in the Bible, that includes Egypt, Babylon, the Persians, what did I say? Egypt, Babylon, the Persians, Greece, and Rome. Greece and Rome. Those five, all the beast nations named in the Bible, they all did the same sacrifices that Israel did in the Torah. They sacrificed bulls, they sacrificed rams, they sacrificed lambs, they sacrificed goats, and small birds. Their method of sacrificing in all of those nations was yet an altar, not always, but sometimes with horns. And this altar, you would have an altar with fire as well, whether there's one or two to each their own. But a fire altar, the animal would be led to the altar, the neck would be slit, the blood would be drained out. Some minor variances with certain different cultures, but all the same basic thing. Slit the throat, blood comes out. You cut the head off, you disembowel the creature, chop it apart, you would put the fat on the altar and burn the fat. Everything's the same. Absolutely everything is the same. Herodotus spoke about this in 450 BC, which is around the time Ezra was rewriting the Tanakh, the Torah, sorry. And do I have time to read this? I don't know. I don't have time to quote this anymore. But Herodotus, if you go look it up, you can find it. Herodotus goes on in 450 BC talking about the rituals that the Egyptians do and how, just like with Judaism, they pick a bull out, the priests examine every hair for a flaw. The creature must be flawless and perfect. And then it's led with celebration to the altar and then killed. It's all the same thing as Judaism. Okay? And then when I studied about the Greek and the Roman sacrifices and the Babylonian sacrifices, I found that they all did the same ones. In fact, of all the creatures on planet Earth, what are the odds that in the law of the Torah, that the same animal sacrifices, of all the millions of species on this earth, of creatures that you could sacrifice, why you would want to, I don't know, but you're telling me that the 4 or 5 that Israel does are the same 4 or 5 that all the beast pagan nations use? Kind of a problem. Why would God come down out of the sky and tell you, hey, let's start copying the pagans? Well, how do you do that? Why would God even want sacrifice to start with, right? So what we can see observably here is the fact that they were surrounded by these cultures. They saw all the other cultures, including Babylon, doing sacrifices for hundreds of thousands of years. They had all been doing sacrifices to their primitive tribal deities. So when they came to this point in history, they felt the need to do them. So while in Babylon, they had the prime opportunity, the scribes and whoever else, to tinker with the text and put these things in there. It's not even that they had to do it maliciously. They just probably felt that it was necessary, that God needed it. Okay? And that's why they copied all of the sacrifices. The Egyptians used to sacrifice lambs. The rabbis lie because they're so uneducated. They say that, oh, God ordained the Passover sacrifice to insult the Egyptians. It's so uneducated. Get educated. The Egyptians ate lamb on a daily basis. They sacrificed lambs. What? I don't know what these rabbis read, or maybe they just make up stuff. You know what I mean? Maybe they just make it up. Egyptians ate lamb. They sacrificed lambs. Isis, female lambs are sacred to Isis, and you couldn't kill a female lamb, but male lambs were the ones used. Young male lambs were used for the sacrifices, just like Judaism. Okay? It's all the same. That's what they did. They emulated them. Same with the ark, the tabernacle, everything else is emulation of Egypt, and then later on they emulated Babylon and everything else. So, and the Greeks and the Romans, shockingly, the Greeks and the Romans did the same sacrifices. If I was to read you how the Romans sacrificed their rams and all their animals, it's like you're lifting it off the pages of the Torah. You put it on the fiery altar, you splash the blood out on the walls, on the sides. You know, it's all the same. Okay, I wish I had time to read some of this. Maybe I'll read one here. Here, worship in ancient Greek religion typically consisted of sacrificing domestic animals at the altar with hymn and prayer. The altar was outside any temple building and might not be associated with a temple at all. The animal, which should be perfect of its kind, is decorated with garlands and the like, and led in procession to the altar, a girl with a basket on her head containing the concealed knife leading the way. After various rituals, the animal is slaughtered over the altar. As it falls, the women present must cry out in high, shrill tones. Its blood is collected and poured over the altar. It is butchered on the spot, and its various internal organs, bones, and other inedible parts burnt as the deity's portion of the offering. Kind of sounds like God's burnt offerings, right? While the meat is removed to be prepared for the participants to eat, and in Egypt and the other respective religions, the priests would eat them, the best part, the thigh portion. Oh, it's identical to the Torah law. It's identical. Okay? The animals used in Greece for sacrificial preference were bull, ox, cow, sheep, goat, small birds, and pigs. That's the only difference. Piglets were the cheapest animal and were for poor people, or if you messed things up and you had no other bull to do, go grab a quick pig. It's the same thing. Romans, Greeks, Egyptians, Babylonians all did the same sacrificial system. Why in the name of God would Israel emulate that? Why in the name of God would God emulate that for Israel? It's ridiculous and preposterous to think such. Even the ancient Greeks had more brains. It says here, according to Greek ancient comedy, it says the humans, they used to joke, got more use from the sacrifice than the actual deities. They would even joke about that in their comedies back then because they saw the folly in this primitive practice. The ancient Greeks from 2,500 years ago. Even they had the sense to see that there's no God getting benefit from this. But why is it thousands of years later the Jews to this very day think that they need animal sacrifice to please their God? Preposterous. Preposterous. Absolutely preposterous. Satanism has the sacrifice of your firstborn male son. Judaism teaches, Abraham was commanded to go sacrifice his firstborn son. No, the text actually says bring him up there for a going up. He's supposed to be taken up there to ascend, to go up to God, so God could take him, not so that Abraham could butcher him and kill him and burn him like an animal sacrifice. You know what I mean? It's preposterous. Why does Judaism still teach that? The text doesn't even say that. Abraham might have been dumb enough to go try and kill him, if the text is accurate there, but God rebuked it. God never told him go kill your son. God told him to not kill your son, and God told him to make your son ascend. You see what I mean? They have all these primitive concepts which are shared by all the other pagan nations. Hey, you got to please God? You want to please God? Show your worth? Kill your firstborn son. And that's what they do in Satanism to this very day. If you want to show your allegiance to Satan, you go sacrifice your firstborn son. People do it. It's in the news. It's a fact. Okay? Why would God have so many similarities to pagan nations and to Satanism itself? It's ludicrous. Why would you be putting blood on your ears and your toes and splashing blood around and all this sick evil, twisting the head off birds, splitting animals in half, and all this psycho stuff? But what are the turds? What are the terms here, right? The sacrifices, they serve no purpose. They are illogical. They are primitive. They are evil. They are psychotic. They are heathen, and they are unjust. Like, no matter how you look at it, they're wacko and wrong from so many reasons. Anyways, I have 2 minutes, so I can only read out the verse numbers. I cannot read the verses. The following verses here outright rebuke the sacrifices from every conceivable angle. And when you read through all these verses, take the time, take the half an hour to go get them, read them in the original Masoretic translation. If you can't find that, go get a YLT, Young's Literal Translation. Go to BibleGateway.com. Okay? Proverbs, I'll try to read, Proverbs 15, verse 8. Proverbs 17, verse 1. Proverbs 21:27. Proverbs 21:3. Okay? Ecclesiastes 5, verse 1. Amos 4:4. Amos 5:25. Jeremiah 6:20. Jeremiah 7:21 onwards. Hosea 4:19, Hosea 6 verse 6, Hosea 8 verse 13, Hosea 9 verse 4, Hosea 11:12, Hosea 12:11, Isaiah 1:11, Isaiah 34:6, Isaiah 43:24, Isaiah 66:3, 1 Samuel above, which I already mentioned. Then from Psalms, I didn't do the book of Psalms. Oh no, I did. Psalm 4:5, Psalm 27:6, Psalm 40 verse 6, Psalm 50 almost in its entirety, verses 14, 16, 17, and more. Malachi 1 verse 8. Okay, that's 23 verses. There are more in the Bible, probably a few more. Okay, but these outright rebuke them. Okay, outright rebuke them. It's very, very important for people to go read this and understand it. Even in Jeremiah alone, God says that the Torah scribes have lied, and he says, I never commanded you regarding sacrifices when you came out of Egypt. Never. In a lot of these verses, it calls the sacrifices, in one or two, it actually portrays them as being evil. It portrays people who do sacrifices as fools. Okay, it says that God hates them, loathes them, never commanded them, didn't want them, the thought never crossed his mind. Sacrifices or offerings. So there's no biblical grounds to believe that God gave them. There is fair, reasonable grounds to think that this stuff was falsely inserted into the Torah while they were in Babylon, or thereabouts, close enough. That was a prime time for it to be manipulated. Okay? And what's their motive to do it? They just really thought God needed this primitive stuff. Okay? That's it. That's all I have time for. God bless you all. Gotta go.